probably takes, maybe 10% extra to build this stuff in up front. But it saves, in my mind, at least like 50% of administrative overhead. Now, not every time you build one of these formulas is it ever going to change or ever prove to be necessary, but you don't really have to have it play out that way every time. If it plays out a few times here and there, then you've saved yourself well worth the time of investment.
So Mike's got some unique perspectives on how we can use formula fields to be way more powerful. And let's think about three different use cases. So Mike, the first one is you were talking to me about a foundation or a linchpin formula. So can you explain to me what that is?
So maybe if it's opportunities, you're talking about, certain types of opportunities that meets a certain record type, have a certain date range, have a certain status, have a certain dollar amount, whatever it is. Rather than putting any of those multiple conditions into any of those other things, flow or report or list views, I will go ahead and make a formula field on the object that sort of defines what that audience is, what that population is, and give it a label. That usually resolves to be a checkbox, but it could be a text field that results with multiple different things. So, it could be A, B, C, or D, or whatever. And then I will make all of the automation trigger that thing where that value is true, or that formula resolves to X, Y, Z. And the real advantage to that is inevitably when the criteria needs to change, all you have to do is change the formula in one place, and then every report, every list view, every automation element you have will automatically follow those rules. And that even applies like if you create a new field or a new object that didn't even exist when you started, because you can then amend the formula to just reference that or look at that. So, nothing's ever completely future proof, but as much as you can, you make it a little future proof so that you don't have to go back and revisit that. It just allows the application to scale sort of, more or less infinitely with very little administrative overhead.
Mike Grandel is the principal architect. He is 13 times certified, including just recently got the BA certification. Great to hear that. And he is the Baltimore Administrator User Group Leader. And I think you'll find out after this session, I think we'll nickname him the Formula Whisperer. This sounds amazing. So are other people doing this, or is this something very new to you?
Honestly, it came from, I worked for small organizations where I didn't really have the capacity to sort of have a lot of administrative overhead to keep the trains running on the things that I already did if I was going to get to the next thing. So I needed to find a way to make that administrative overhead as limited as possible so I could get to the next thing. I get frustrated by, we agreed to these requirements, we built based on these requirements, and then now we need to go back and edit those requirements. And sometimes that's happening when you're in sort of development, but also, it could happen a year or 2 years later. You get a new manager, or some new process comes into play.
That is really smart. So can you give me an example of how this would work in practice?
Sure. I'm working with a client right now where they want to have a certain set of their accounts based on their membership annually complete a process, right? So that is going to potentially evolve over time. I already have a formula on the account that is, are these active members, are these active whatever? But I went ahead and I just made another formula that was, essentially needs to complete this process. It is true. And right now, the formula is just looking at, are they an active member, right? But this allows me to not have to edit the active member formula if they ever want to say, well, we don't want all active members. We only want active members that didn't complete it in the past 60 days or only have a certain status or only have whatever else they have. So it just allows that to go to wherever they want it to go in the future very easily.
So that was the first thing. So the second thing you talked to me about a way of applying formulas to record types. Now, record types are like glitter. Once you've got them, you can't get rid of them, and they're really hard to maintain. So talk to me about how you apply formulas to record types.
Okay, so when you put the record type field on the page layout, it automatically comes with the ability for the user to change record types if they have the ability to reassign record types as part of their permissions. Generally speaking, again, none of these things apply as an absolute statement, but generally speaking, I don't want them to change record types because that might trigger field requirements or validations or automation or anything like that. So what I would usually do is I will go through and I would just make a formula that sort of maps the record type name to a text formula, so I can have as many different record types as I want, and I can put that formula field on the page layout or in the highlights panel or whatever, and they can see the kind of thing that it is. But even beyond that, it has some additional uses in that. Um, a lot of times, and I think this is an underutilized feature of Salesforce, like record type doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship between the kind of thing it is. So another example is I've worked with a bank where they would have their opportunities record types essentially be like mortgages or car loans or things like that, where they were tracking. They'd have certain fields that they wanted to track, um, but they wanted the page layout to be different when it was an open opportunity versus when it was closed won, because when it was closed won, there might be additional fields that they wanted to track about how it was making its way through the process, the loan process, or last payment date or anything like that they wanted to bring in. So we would make two record types for the same thing. So there'd be two mortgage record types, if you would. One would be mortgage open, and one would be mortgage closed won. But then this formula field would just call it mortgage. That way, the user didn't really have to think about what it was. It didn't matter to them. They could tell whether it was closed one or open based on the stage. But then there'd be automation behind the scenes that would just switch the record type from one to the other when it reached a certain stage. So the page would update, the page layout would update, and it would just be invisible to the user. And then any reports that they were using would just be on mortgage. It didn't matter which record type it was, right? In that way, you're consolidating in that way. And some of that stuff, honestly, can be done other ways now with lightning pages and dynamic forms and things like that. So maybe all of these use cases aren't as applicable as they once were, but I think the general concepts are. Have at least one record type on an object, even if I'm not planning to use record types, because adding a second or third or fourth record type to an object in Salesforce is very easy. Going from zero record types to one record types requires you to go back and sort of update all of your existing records, because you're taking it off the master record type onto the record type that you're using. So I would generally just create a one record type, and then use the formula to sort of show that field, whatever it is on there. And then the record type is functionally invisible to the user when you're only using one, because they're not going to get an option to choose a record type if there's only one anyway. So that's just another way to not have to go back and clean up all your old data when they decide, oh, we need a different kind of thing that we didn't plan for originally.
Hang on. So there are two really interesting things you picked up there. One is, even if you don't think you're going to use record types, you still set one up. So therefore, in the future, someone comes back and says, "Can we have another record type?" That's easy. But then the really neat thing is this idea of having formulas drive record types, and then the concept is something could have multiple record types during its lifetime. And I've never heard that before. I mean, that's really clever. And is this only available when you start from scratch, or do you think is it possible to reverse engineer any of this?
Oh, it's definitely possible to reverse engineer any of it. The question is whether the juice is worth the squeeze, right? If the idea is to save administrative, overhead to keep an app going, is it worth going in after something's already functioning and sort of re-architecting it, even if it's only slightly, to go back to that, or is it worth just making the changes as they come up? But to me, it's clearly almost always the right way to go if you're building something brand new, because then you're building in that scalability eventually.
If you're driving app tech debt, if you're looking at record types, if you're thinking about embarking on dynamic pages, then maybe this is the time to think about the approach you've just come up with.
Absolutely right. I mean, that's another use case that I didn't mention was, when you're creating the conditional visibility on dynamic pages, it's another use case of, well, I only want to see this component, whether it's a list view or whatever it is, if certain multiple conditions are true, or rather than having those conditions be like multiple steps in a conditional visibility, like you would do in a report or a list view or a flow, just make one formula field that controls all of them. Also, I think a lot of times it makes it easier for the user if they're going to make reports or their own list views, to just know that they only have to look at one field, and that'll give them all of the things, and it'll follow sort of the current definition of what those things are, even if it's changed over time. Now, of course, one of the drawbacks to any of this approach is you may not always want to change the historical thing, right? You may want to have a category of whatever this is, but you want to draw a distinction between well, 3 years ago this was the rule, and now this is the rule. I mean, you can do that to some degree in the formulas. If you have the data, you can put conditions in so that it only considers records after a certain date range or things like that. But not that's not always true. That can make your life more difficult. Also, when you're doing things like um, adding a filter to a report or adding a condition in a flow. If it's a formula that you're going off of, you have to like type in the value that the formula is going to give out, right? And you have to know that. But if you're doing it with like a pick list field for an example, like it's going to the list view filter and the flow is going to like give you the options. You don't have to know the right one. So then there's definitely some trade offs, that you have to consider. But I mean, by and large, I like the other approach of using those formulas.
There's another benefit to this is you're actually simplifying things. If you've got those criteria littered all over different, it's in flows, it's in process builder workflows, it's in list views, it's in dynamic pages. The chance of missing that when you want to go make a change, and then suddenly everyone's driving their decisions off data which actually they believe to be true but actually isn't true because they didn't realize that the criteria were wrong. This strikes at the heart of well architected, which is we need to make sure everything is driven off a common set of rules, if you want to put it that way, and you know where it is, and it's only in one place, and therefore it's easy to control.
Sometimes there will be edge cases where the data might not be accurate, or you might not have a field to track the data, or other cases where a new manager's come in, or they just want to sort of change what the definitions are. By having an override field, I essentially, when I make that sort of formula that determines whatever it is, I can give another field with field level security so that only certain people would be able to view it or access it. Most of the people wouldn't even know that it was there, right? I would just not make it visible or editable to most people, and then give a permission set to whatever manager or person could change that. And essentially, it allows people to override the standard result of what the formula would give by allowing them to just plug in a value. And the override field is built into the base formula, where essentially it's just the formula, the base formula just either accepts the override value, or if that's blank, I use the blank value function and say like if that override field is blank, then do the real formula. And if the override field has a value, then just use that value.
You've just shown me three fantastic ways of using formulas. Maybe we should be calling you the formula whisperer as your hashtag. But it's so. What skills do I need if I'm an admin or an architect listening to this? Is it just standard formula field
Yeah,
functionality?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. There. I mean, I would say there are certain functions that you might want to master. I mean, case functions and nested if functions, which can confuse people sometimes. Switch the case whenever you can. The blank value is probably my favorite function that I ever use, because that's how that override system works. It basically is use the override unless it's blank, and then use this other thing. Um, but really don't need that. You don't really need anything other than the basic functions and formulas that you would write in general. But just try to think. I guess the mindset is try not to just think for solving today's problem, but you're putting in an option for what if something changes tomorrow or next year. The ability to sort of scale and grow it. It's not just what it is today, because we're always changing. So this just allows that to be easier to maintain.
So that sounds like the other skill set is the business analysis, the ability to ask the questions. So when someone says, just build me a formula for this, you go, yeah, I get that. But actually, can I just ask some more questions to understand what the edge cases are? You talked about asking questions. I think you used the word discovery. I think it's actually, rather than being an order taker, you actually need to be more the consultant or the analyst to understand the scope of how the formula can be applied, so then you can abstract it.
100%, absolutely right. I mean, you don't necessarily even have to get into some of these overrides or linchpin formulas, or how you're architecting it with the client, as long as they get the function to work the way that they need it to work. But yes, that's what I'm thinking when I'm asking the discovery questions and I'm poking around at the edge cases. I'm trying to think, well, how likely is this to change? How likely is this to evolve? Um, There are maybe certain things that are sort of finite. They can't go anywhere. Like there's only 7 days in a week. I don't have to account for there becoming an eighth day in the week, right? There's certain things I can rely on, but most other situations are going to have a potential, value to sort of evolve over time.
So, Ed, have you a last thought for the people who are listening to this?
I guess that thought is, again, just try not to think about the here and now only. You're not only solving today's problem. Um, yes, it definitely can take a little more to future proof it or design wise. I feel like maybe it's like a 10% extra to go through. So if you have the luxury of that time, take advantage of it because I feel like it's going to solve, I don't know, 50% of your administrative overhead problem later. You're not going to have as many errors or as many confusion points or as many re-architecting or redesigning flows and list views and reports. So I think it well pays off over time. But just try to think not just for what you're solving today, but what the situation is going to be in the future.